Well, good morning. Again, I'm the Reverend Eric David Carlson. I use the pronouns he, him, and his, and I am incredibly honored to be your guest minister this morning. So, a little less than 16 years ago now, I would answer a call to be the minister of a small rural congregation in northwest Illinois, tiny little town called Stockton. And despite my initial trepidation to serve a less than urban ministry, this little historically Universalist congregation would teach me more about our ministry and theology than I could have possibly imagined. This small little white clapboard church in the middle of the fertile Midwest prairie was founded by Universalists in the last year of the 19th century, and has stood as a lone beacon of liberal religion for nearly 13 decades now. There were even several members among the congregation who had been born into the church, direct descendants of founders 3 or 4 or even 5 generations before. One of these, we'll for the time being call him Art. Art was a retired farmer in his late 80s, and he would glower at me from the pew that his family had held since before he was born whenever I would mention political agendas or hint at my own liberal leanings. He was particularly hostile towards any discussion of workers' rights or anything that might be construed as social gasp. So one Sunday early in my ministry, I pulled him aside during coffee hour, and I tried to seek some answers to my questions and reconcile my understanding of our faith with what he thought it was. How could he be so skeptical of a social safety net or against government intervening in order to help people who are less fortunate? He would smile paternalistically and tell me that the government didn't do him any good, and he didn't trust the government to do anyone else any good either. So, gruff, yet entertaining of my questions, he went away from our conversations pretty much unchanged. And I was confused and a bit disappointed as a young minister that I couldn't find any way to connect with ideas, or really to connect him with my ideas. But the longer I stayed at the church, the more I learned about Art and his true universalism. Just before I arrived in town, neighbors whom he barely knew had a fire in their barn complex. The fire burned quickly, and the barn was gone by morning. The rural volunteer fire department was unable to do anything to stop the loss of the structure, and were there essentially to make sure that the fire didn't spread to the fields or to other buildings. But Art was there, with a crew of people he'd assembled before dawn. They brought shovels and rakes, but also trucks and tractors and cranes and front loaders. It was a veritable parade of equipment and labor on hand when the sun broke over the eastern horizon that morning. In a matter of hours, the still smoldering rubble would be methodically removed, and the frame of a new barn would begin to take shape. And in the middle of it was Art, NRA belonging, Tea partying, Universalist Art, relying not on the government, but on himself to get things done. Now, this is universalism in action. This is the lesson that Art was able to share with me, that it isn't what one believes or even how one votes that makes one a universalist. It's what one does. In that moment, on that crisp fall morning, Art barely knew his neighbors. He certainly wouldn't have known their political persuasions, and if he did, it wouldn't matter. In that moment, the only thing of importance was that his neighbor was in need, and there's no choice but to help. It's just what you do. Or, as another strong, gruff Universalist farmer would tell me, I don't have to like you, but I've got to love you. Universalism. So the oft forgotten but most important part of our name, right, Unitarian Universalist, is what actually defines us as a faith movement, at least currently. So you know all those new values centered around love, right, pluralism, and yes, right? The love is universalism. Now, this is a concept that has existed for a very long time, at least 1,800 years in the Christian tradition, and in other faiths for much longer than that. Our direct tie to this theology of love begins in the 2nd century of the Common Era, or less than 200 years after the man we know as Jesus lived and died, through a teacher appropriately named Origen. Now, Origen of Alexandria was an early Christian scholar and is considered among the church fathers, though he himself was never canonized. He was never sainted for sake of a couple specific heresies. Ironically, the first he was condemned involved his Unitarian view of God, but it's actually the second we're most interested in this morning. Origen expresses his understanding of the end of the world and what happens after we die. In seminary, we call this eschatology, but it's really just the idea of what happens after this lifetime. And Origen expresses it as the ultimate reconciliation and reunion of all creation with the Creator. Now, in his language, they would call this apokatastasis. But all you have to remember is it's universalism. This is akin to the Big Bang, Big Crunch model of astrophysics, right? Where singularity turns to multiplicity only to return eventually to singularity. It also informs traditional Universalist theology in that it claims we all come from and eventually return to the same source, taking the possibility of eternal damnation for anyone or anything off the table, right? Hell cannot exist in perpetuity if we all return to the same place from which we came. Now, the modern ethical interpretation of this mindset is, of course, that we all matter, we all have value, none of us is more or less important than any other, and each of us in our own way is beholden to serve the greater good. The modern spiritual interpretation of this is the metaphor that we all come from a loving, benevolent source to which we will ultimately return and to which we are ultimately responsible. Whereas I like to think Origen was centering love a full 1,800 for our current UU's value statement. Now, I was fortunate to be able to attend the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association in Phoenix, Arizona, in June of 2012. I was representing the congregation I was serving then and as a member of the UUA Board of Trustees. Now, this was a very controversial General Assembly, dubbed Justice GA. Does anyone remember Justice GA? Of course, Reverend Chris does. But there was a law passed a few years earlier in Arizona that allowed local police to arrest and indefinitely detain anyone suspected of being undocumented. Sound familiar? The law, the infamous SB 1070, would be enacted prior to our going, and many groups were calling for a wholesale boycott of Arizona. But after much debate and political maneuvering amongst the delegates at prior GAs, the decision was made to go to Phoenix in 2012 as planned, but to focus on justice issues and limit our business proceedings to the very minimum required by our bylaws. In other words, it was inappropriate to go to Phoenix if we weren't to be directly involved in creating positive change and bearing witness to the injustices there. We also committed to engage early and often with groups on the ground who were doing the work, ensuring not only our presence was welcome, but also productive. The week's events culminated with a joint protest of the County Sheriff's Detention Center, dubbed Tent City, a makeshift camp housing more than 2,000 prisoners, none of whom had been convicted of any crime. The inmates, those expected of committing a deportable offense, await trial, sometimes indefinitely, and were routinely denied access to an attorney or even a phone call. Sound familiar? We heard the stories and names of the 122 inmates at Tent City who had died in the previous year, none of whom, again, had been convicted of any crime. We Unitarian Universalists assembled that last Sunday of the conference in the shadow of Tent City, and despite the counter-protesters who would try to incite us, and the sheriff's deputies who proudly displayed their tank and donned riot gear, we maintained our peaceful, loving attitude. Busloads of UUs arrived at the site and proceeded to that great Sarah Dan Jones, "When I breathe in peace. When I breathe out love." And simply passed in song the neo-Nazis and Minutemen representatives without incident. We heard from a panel of interfaith speakers, including UCC President Reverend Jeffrey Black, who dedicated his churches to the cause of migrant justice, joining the UUs, and representatives from our partner organizations, Somos Arizona and Puente. And our youth delegation was right at the front of the crowd, singing and chanting while donning yellow Side of Love shirts in various degrees of teenage modification. And 2 days later, we heard from our U.S. Supreme Court, which ultimately agreed with what we'd been saying, that SB 1070 and laws like it are unconstitutional principles of due process and the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. But even more important, at least for me that week, was what happened my final night there. After the closing ceremonies, everybody went out to dinner, and I mean everybody. 3,000 UUs or so took to the streets near the convention center and flooded all of the available restaurants at the same time. I sought in vain for a table or a group or anybody I could join. The first several spots I stopped at, but eventually found a restaurant with a large outdoor patio, and one of those tables in the back was filled with our UU youth, some of whom I'd met at the protest, others the night prior at the bridging ceremony. It was an honor to serve you, and God bless you all. Now, any question I had about whether or not we were helping evaporated in that instant. Someone who would have had every right to be at least annoyed with the loud, obnoxious teenagers at the table, knew who we were, why we were there, and what we were trying to do, and was appreciative of that. Now, the great 19th century Universalist preacher Hosea Ballou once said that if we can agree in love, then disagreements can do us no harm. This is the belief that allows us to set aside our differences and focus on what we can do together. Be it comfort one another in times of loss, help each other celebrate life's great joys, help our neighbor when she is homeless or hungry, or simply live within that tragic gap, as Parker Palmer says, between what is and what ought to be. And we have so much of a gap right now. I know it can seem overwhelming and depressing, and we might feel despondent or worse. The time when ICE is trying to do on a national scale what Arizona attempted to do with SB 1070 over a decade ago. When wars and the threat of wars are made at the whim of a single leader through the lens of a social media post. When it feels like the only people getting richer are those already rich, and the numbers are even worse than we feared. I too have despaired at the news of late. I too have contemplated our failure of our people and our democracy to simply do the decent thing towards our neighbors and each other. Not currently leading a congregation as I have the last 2 decades has meant I don't feel like I have as much of an individual impact as I once did. And it's been hard. It's been hard to sit back and watch from not exactly the sidelines, maybe the bench, right? But just as in Phoenix all those years ago now, my faith continues to be restored by our young people. This last week, students all across the country staged walkouts in solidarity with Minneapolis students protesting ICE. The First Unitarian Society's own youth, Susie, was one of the student organizers at her South Milwaukee high school and reached out to Reverend Kimberly to ask her to accompany the march this past Friday. But because Reverend Kimberly was still traveling home from that conference last week, she asked if I might go. So bundling up against the cold and donning a yellow Side with Love stole, I set off to find a youth I'd only met in passing and simply help bear witness and support these students, some of whom were demonstrating for the first time in their lives. I parked at the school where I saw other parents opening up minivans and SUVs filled with protest signs. One was setting up a hand-warming station and heating a huge carafe that I would later learn contained hot chocolate. Right at 12:30, students started exiting the school and crossing the street to where we were parked. A dozen or so, then more. Then a crowd descended upon the chilly corner. Knowing to look for a yellow stole, Susie ran up to me and introduced herself and her friends, and we started to march. And despite some real concern that most of those who left the school would not also march, Susie and the other organizers were amazed at how many folks came out, huddled in the bitter, bitter cold. Over 300 of the 900 or so student body was there, spreading out across the sidewalks as we traversed the snowy ground to demonstrate along Route 32, the busiest and thus most visible location within walking distance of the school. Signs like, "We're skipping our lessons to teach you one," and "Wisconsin's cold enough without ice, thank you," dotted the crowd. And despite the frigid temperatures and a temporary snow squall in the middle of the protest, these kids chanted and sang raucously for over 2 hours, screeching in applause at every car that honked on the way by, goading 18-wheelers to blat blat their air horns, many of which did. A local UCC church adjacent to the protest site opened its doors as a warming shelter, and hot chocolate was doled out in little cups. Too cold and windy to deliver speeches, organizers handed out printed statements from students regarding the protest, which included statements about dignity, justice, and due process. They were quoted on CBS News locally and seen by hundreds of folks driving by. And I was struck by how much of an honor it was to be there among them. Not as an organizer or a speaker, not as a chaperone or instructor, but rather as a participant, following their lead, a peer in our demonstration for justice. Just like in Phoenix at that crowded restaurant, our young people were demonstrating what it means to live out our universalism. And it's pretty simple, actually, to live one's life by ever choosing love over fear, one decision at a time. I say it's simple, but it's not easy. It's perhaps simple to say that I don't have to like you, but I have to love you, but it's so much harder to practice. That we care as much and deeply for those with whom we disagree can be a very difficult task. Impossible to get right all the time, as none of us are perfectly loving, even on our best days. And we certainly can't do it alone. That's why we come to places like First Unitarian Society, and why when our kids invite us to a protest, we show up. That's why we try to build our families and social circles with those who will support us in our journey as we endeavor to help our loved ones ourselves. And that's why we take as much inspiration from our future Universalist leaders like Susie as we do from the heroes of our collective past, like Origen and Ballou and Jordan Willis and Bumbaugh. All of them, past, present, and future, pointing us towards community and the consistent advocacy of love and justice and dignity. And all we can do is keep showing up for one another and keep marching together. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen.